The airport lounge hummed with the soft buzz of conversations, clinking glasses, and the occasional announcement over the intercom. Derek Marshall, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, walked in with the confidence of a man who belonged, though the room's collective gaze suggested otherwise. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Heads turned, and whispers followed him like shadows as he approached the bar. Some passengers looked intrigued, others indifferent, and a few visibly uncomfortable. Derek, unbothered, ordered a black coffee and smiled at the bartender, who hesitated before reciprocating. Seated nearby, Officer Jim Collis glanced over the rim of his newspaper, his eyes narrowing as they settled on Derek. Jim was off duty, but his demeanor, stiff, observant, and ever-judging, remained intact. Derek pulled out his phone and answered a call, his voice calm but authoritative as he discussed the closing of a major acquisition. Jim muttered to himself, "Some people don't know how to keep a low profile," though no one was around to hear him. The newspaper crinkled as he set it down, his gaze now fixed on Derek like a hunter watching prey. When it was time to board, Derek approached the security checkpoint. The line moved smoothly until the agent gestured for him to step aside. "Random screening," they said, their tone devoid of warmth. Derek exhaled quietly, slipping off his shoes and placing his briefcase on the conveyor belt. Behind him, Jim watched the scene unfold with a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. A passenger next to him chuckled and whispered, "Well, they're just being thorough." Derek endured the additional screening in silence, his jaw tightening only slightly when the agent searched his belongings longer than necessary. By the time he reached the gate, the priority boarding group was already filing onto the plane. Derek took a moment to straighten his suit and adjust his tie before stepping into the first-class cabin. As Derek settled into his seat, placing his sleek leather briefcase in the overhead compartment, he felt the weight of stares from the other passengers. A woman across the aisle whispered something to her companion, her tone sharp and disapproving. Derek caught fragments of the comment, "Not what I expected in first class," but chose to ignore it. He had learned long ago that responding only fed the beast. A few moments later, Jim entered the cabin. He froze briefly upon seeing Derek, his brows furrowing in disbelief. Leaning toward the flight attendant, Jim whispered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Are you sure he's in the right seat?" The attendant's smile faltered, but she nodded politely. "Yes, sir. Mr. Marshall is a first-class passenger." Jim grunted and moved to his own seat, a few rows behind Derek. Even as he stowed his bag and buckled his seatbelt, his eyes remained fixed on the back of Derek's head. The plane filled quickly, the cabin doors sealing with a hiss. As the flight attendant passed out pre-flight drinks, Derek requested a glass of champagne, his voice calm but firm. The attendant hesitated, glancing toward the other passengers before fulfilling his request. When she handed him the glass, her smile seemed forced, her discomfort barely concealed. Jim, observing the exchange, called out, "I'll have one too." He sipped his champagne with exaggerated relish, then muttered loudly, "Sparkling water might have been a better choice for some." His tone dripped with derision. Derek ignored him, raising his glass to the attendant in a silent toast before returning to his laptop. He opened a document, scanning the screen with an intensity that spoke of years of discipline and focus. As the plane taxied down the runway, the cabin grew quiet, save for the muffled rustle of magazines and the faint hum of engines. Derek leaned back in his seat, his face calm but unreadable, as though he'd built an invisible wall against the judgment radiating from every corner of the cabin. Jim, however, was far from settled. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between Derek and the window. The irritation that had started as a spark was now a flame, fed by his own assumptions and the whispers of agreement from passengers nearby. The plane took off, climbing into the endless blue, but the air inside the cabin remained heavy. Derek's presence, his success, his very existence in a space Jim believed he didn't belong, had ignited a quiet storm, a storm that would soon prove impossible to ignore. The plane soared into the clear blue sky, leaving the ground far behind. But inside the cabin, tension hung heavy. Derek reclined his seat slightly, opening his laptop to review the detailed blueprints of a new urban development project. The screen's glow reflected off his glasses as he made precise annotations, occasionally sipping his champagne. His composure, his success. It was a silent rebuke to the unspoken assumptions filling the room. Jim, sitting just a few rows behind, watched him with growing irritation. His gut churned with a mix of anger and unease, as though Derek's calm defiance was a personal affront. He leaned toward the passenger beside him, an elderly man clutching a leather-bound book. "Don't you think it's odd?" Jim muttered. "Guy's sitting there, flashing his laptop like he owns the place. Makes you wonder." The old man frowned slightly but didn't respond. Jim took this as agreement. In the meantime, Derek pressed the service button and politely asked for a glass of water when the flight attendant arrived. She hesitated, glancing at Jim and a few other passengers before nodding. It took longer than necessary for her to return, and when she did, her smile was strained. "Thank you," Derek said, his tone warm and sincere. The attendant quickly turned away, but not before Jim leaned over and whispered loudly to the passenger next to him. "Demanding, isn't he?" The passenger chuckled awkwardly, looking unsure. Jim took this as encouragement and continued, his voice deliberately loud. "You know how some people always think they're entitled to more?" Derek's eyes flicked up for the briefest of moments before he returned to his work. He had perfected the art of composure under fire. But the snide remarks, the murmurs, the whispers, it was a storm gathering strength. The first bout of turbulence struck, sending a slight jolt through the cabin. The lights flickered momentarily, and passengers gripped their armrests. Derek remained calm, his hand steady on the keyboard as he adjusted a graph on his screen. "Doesn't even flinch," Jim muttered, loud enough for Derek to hear. "Must be used to flying private jets." Derek, without looking up, said evenly, "Experience teaches you to stay calm under pressure." Jim bristled. The response wasn't confrontational, but it felt like a challenge. "Is that so?" he said, leaning forward in his seat. "What exactly do you do for a living, Mr. Calm under pressure?" Derek turned slightly, meeting Jim's gaze with polite neutrality. "I run a real estate development company. We focus on affordable housing in underserved communities." Jim snorted. "Must have had a lot of help along the way, huh?" Derek's smile didn't falter. "Hard work and education do wonders." Jim leaned back, smirking as if he'd won a point. "Sure, everyone gets their on hard work, right?" The turbulence subsided, but the cabin remained charged. A child nearby asked their mother in a loud whisper, "Why does that man look different from everyone else?" The mother hushed the child, her face reddening, but the words hung in the air. Derek excused himself and stood, heading toward the restroom at the back of the cabin. As he walked past, he felt the weight of a dozen eyes on him. Conversations stopped and heads turned, tracking his every step. While Derek was gone, Jim leaned into the aisle and motioned for the flight attendant. "Hey," he said, lowering his voice. "Don't you think he's acting a little suspicious? He's been typing non-stop on that laptop, and now he's spending a lot of time in the bathroom. You might want to keep an eye on him." The attendant looked uncomfortable, but nodded slightly before walking away. When Derek returned to his seat, he found Jim watching him intently. As Derek reached to adjust his briefcase, Jim stood abruptly. "What are you doing with that bag?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to draw attention. Derek paused, then calmly looked up. "Moving it to make room for my legs. Is that a problem?" Jim crossed his arms, his face reddening. "You're acting suspicious, that's all I'm saying. With everything going on these days, you can't blame people for being cautious." "Cautious," Derek repeated, his tone cool. "Or presumptuous?" Before Jim could respond, the flight attendant approached, her hands clasped nervously. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between them. Jim pointed at Derek's briefcase. "I think we should check his bag. For everyone's safety." Derek's jaw tightened, but he forced a measured smile. "You're welcome to check it. I have nothing to hide." The attendant hesitated, but Jim's insistence and the murmurs from other passengers pushed her into action. Derek unzipped the briefcase and handed it over. Inside were neatly organized documents, blueprints, and a sleek tablet. Nothing more. The attendant handed it back, mumbling an apology. Jim, undeterred, muttered, "You're just lucky this time." Derek sat back in his seat, his face calm but his hands gripping the armrests tightly. He spoke softly, his voice carrying just enough for Jim to hear. "Luck has nothing to do with it. Prejudice, however, that's another story." The comment stung, and for a moment, Jim was silent. Around them, passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement with Jim, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The rest of the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the tension thicker than the air outside at 30,000 feet. Derek returned to his laptop, his movements deliberate and precise, while Jim glared at him, the wheels of his prejudice turning faster with every passing second. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane cruised at its steady altitude. Outside, clouds rolled by in a darkening sky. But inside, the storm brewing between Derek and Jim was about to escalate into chaos. The flight attendant wheeled the dinner cart into the first-class cabin. Plates of filet mignon and grilled salmon were placed in front of passengers, and glasses of wine were poured generously. Derek, ever polite, thanked the attendant as she placed his meal before him, though her hand trembled slightly under Jim's sharp gaze. She hurried away without making eye contact. As Derek began eating, Jim couldn't contain himself. "A man like you must enjoy living it up," he said loudly, cutting into his own steak with exaggerated force. "This first-class treatment suits you." Derek paused mid-cut, his expression unreadable. "I worked hard for it," he replied simply, his tone firm but calm. Jim chuckled, his laugh filled with mockery. "Sure. I bet you've got plenty of stories about how you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps." The room went quiet. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others smirked, enjoying the spectacle. Derek placed his fork and knife down, folding his hands neatly on the table. "I don't believe in pulling people down to feel better about myself, but maybe you do." Jim's face darkened. "You don't know a damn thing about me. And yet, you've made quite a few assumptions about me," Derek said, meeting Jim's glare with unwavering calm. His words landed like stones in a still pond, ripples of discomfort spreading throughout the cabin. The tension was broken by another jolt of turbulence, this one stronger than the last. Glasses rattled, and a few passengers gasped as the plane lurched. Derek reached instinctively to steady his laptop, while Jim gripped his armrests. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, "we've encountered some unexpected weather. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We should be through it shortly." The turbulence persisted, the plane shaking enough to make even the calmest passengers uneasy. A woman across the aisle clutched her partner's hand, whispering prayers. Derek remained composed, though his eyes flicked toward the window, gauging the situation. Jim, on the other hand, looked pale, his earlier bravado replaced with a thin veneer of control. As the turbulence intensified, a sudden commotion erupted in the economy cabin. A flight attendant hurried past, her face tight with urgency. Moments later, another attendant appeared, her voice shaking as she addressed the first-class cabin. "If there's a doctor or medical professional on board, we need assistance in row 23. Derek immediately unbuckled his seatbelt, standing up. "I'm not a doctor, but I've had first responder training," he said. The attendant looked relieved and gestured for him to follow. Derek moved swiftly toward the economy cabin, while Jim watched with narrowed eyes. "Of course he's got training," Jim muttered under his breath. A few passengers chuckled nervously. In row 23, a man was slumped over, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Derek knelt beside him, his movements efficient and confident. "What happened?" he asked the attendant. "He complained of chest pain before passing out," she said, handing him a first aid kit. Derek assessed the situation quickly, checking the man's pulse and airway. "It's a possible heart attack. We need to stabilize him until we land," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Do you have oxygen on board?" The attendant nodded and rushed to retrieve the portable oxygen tank. Passengers in the surrounding seats watched in silence, their earlier judgments now replaced with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Derek worked methodically, positioning the man for better airflow and attaching the oxygen mask once it arrived. Back in first class, Jim sat rigid in his seat, his face flushed. A woman across the aisle leaned toward him. "At least someone's doing something," she said, her tone pointed. Jim's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. As the turbulence subsided, the captain announced an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Derek stayed with the unconscious man, monitoring his vitals until the paramedics arrived after landing. The passengers in the economy cabin thanked Derek profusely as he made his way back to his seat. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his tie hung loose, but his expression remained composed. When Derek returned to first class, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The whispers had stopped. The stares had softened. Even the flight attendant greeted him with a genuine smile as she passed by. Jim, however, was visibly fuming. As Derek sat down, Jim leaned forward, his voice low but venomous. "You think you've won people over with your little hero act?" Derek turned slowly to face him, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I wasn't trying to win anyone over. I was just doing what needed to be done." Jim sneered. "People like you always have to prove something." "Maybe," Derek said, his tone sharp but measured. "But the real question is, why do people like you feel so threatened when we do?" Jim opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Around them, the cabin was silent, passengers listening intently to the exchange. Derek turned back to his laptop, leaving Jim to stew in the quiet. As the plane taxied to the gate, the tension between them remained thick. But the tide had turned. Derek's actions had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of those who had judged him. And for Jim, the storm that had raged inside him since takeoff was far from over. The plane sat idly on the tarmac at a small regional airport, its passengers growing restless as they waited for clearance to continue their journey. Outside, the rain drummed steadily against the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the mounting tension inside the cabin. Derek sat calmly in his first-class seat, his laptop once again open, though his fingers rested idly on the keyboard. He could feel the weight of Jim's eyes on him, burning with unchecked anger. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a delay while refueling and additional safety checks were conducted. Groans of frustration rippled through the cabin, but Derek remained unfazed. He had mastered patience in situations far more trying than this. Jim, however, had not. His frustration boiled over, and with the delay as an excuse, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. His broad frame loomed over the aisle, and passengers instinctively pulled back, sensing his agitation. "Hey," Jim barked, addressing Derek directly. His voice was loud enough to silence the nearby murmurs. "I've had enough of your holier-than-thou attitude." Derek slowly closed his laptop and looked up at Jim, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Jim spat, taking a step closer. "Strutting around like you own the place. Acting like you're better than everyone else because you helped out back there." The passengers in first class stared, some looking away uncomfortably, while others leaned in to watch the confrontation unfold. The flight attendant froze mid-aisle, unsure whether to intervene. Derek leaned back in his seat, his calm demeanor only fueling Jim's fury. "I'm not acting like anything," he said evenly. "I saw someone in need and did what I could. That's all." Jim let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, right. You just wanted to show off. You people always have to make everything about yourselves." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Even those who had sided with Jim earlier now looked at him with shock and unease. Derek's expression remained calm, though a flicker of something, disappointment, perhaps, crossed his face. "I see," Derek said after a moment, his voice low but firm. "So that's what this is really about." Jim bristled. "Don't twist my words." "No twisting necessary," Derek replied. He stood, his movements deliberate and controlled, so that he now faced Jim eye to eye. Though Jim had the physical advantage, Derek's presence was commanding in a way that left Jim momentarily unsure. "You've made a lot of assumptions about me since we boarded this plane," Derek continued, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "You don't know my story, my struggles, or my triumphs. But you decided the moment you saw me that I didn't belong here. Why is that?" Jim opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face flushed a deeper red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Derek didn't wait for an answer. "Let me guess. Because of the color of my skin. Because, in your mind, success and respect are things I couldn't possibly have earned." The cabin was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Even the flight attendants, who had been moving quietly between rows, paused to listen. Jim finally found his voice. "You don't know me either," he said, his tone defensive. "You think I'm some kind of racist? I've worked hard for everything I have too." Derek nodded slowly. "I'm sure you have. And yet, here we are. Me, standing calmly, while you shout accusations at me in front of all these people. What does that say about you?" The words hit Jim like a punch, and for a moment, he faltered. The passengers around them watched intently, some nodding in agreement with Derek's words, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jim's face twisted with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "You're twisting everything to make me the bad guy," he muttered, his voice quieter now. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." Derek raised an eyebrow. "Are you? Or are you just giving yourself permission to say the things you know are wrong because you think no one will challenge you?" A woman seated nearby, the same one who had earlier whispered disapproval of Derek, suddenly spoke up. "I think he's right," she said quietly. "We all made assumptions, and he proved us wrong." Jim shot her a glare, but she didn't look away. Other passengers murmured their agreement, the tide of the room shifting against him. The flight attendant finally stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Gentlemen, I think it's best if we return to our seats and let things settle." Derek nodded, stepping back without another word. Jim hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. But eventually, he returned to his seat as well. The silence in the cabin was thick, the atmosphere electric with unresolved tension. Derek reopened his laptop, his focus returning to his work. Jim sat stiffly, his fists clenched and his mind racing. For the first time, the certainty of his assumptions began to waver. As the plane prepared for takeoff once more, the rain outside had slowed, and the storm clouds began to part. Inside, however, the storm between Derek and Jim had reached its peak, and its aftermath would change them both in ways neither could yet imagine. The plane was back in the air, cruising smoothly, but the tension in the first-class cabin remained palpable. Passengers whispered among themselves, the earlier confrontation between Derek and Jim replaying in their minds. Even the flight attendants moved quietly, avoiding any unnecessary interactions that might reignite the fire. Derek kept his focus on his laptop, though his thoughts lingered on Jim's words. He had faced prejudice before, plenty of times, but something about this encounter felt heavier, more personal. Perhaps it was the confined space, or the fact that Jim had chosen to make his disdain so public. Whatever it was, it gnawed at Derek's calm exterior, even as he refused to show it. Jim sat stiffly in his seat, his arms crossed and his jaw clenched. His earlier confidence had been shaken, and though he would never admit it, Derek's words had struck a nerve. The truth he didn't want to face was that his assumptions had been baseless, driven by a prejudice he had long denied existed within him. But instead of reckoning with it, he simmered in his anger, looking for a way to reclaim the upper hand. The silence between them stretched on until it was interrupted by a sharp crackle from the intercom. The captain's voice, calm but serious, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a technical issue with one of our engines. It's under control, but as a precaution, we'll be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." A ripple of panic spread through the passengers. Faces turned pale, and whispered prayers filled the cabin. The flight attendants moved swiftly, checking seatbelts and issuing instructions with forced smiles. The plane jolted slightly, and gasps filled the air. Derek closed his laptop and sat up straight, his eyes scanning the cabin. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but his mind was already running through potential scenarios. Jim, on the other hand, gripped the armrests of his seat, so tightly his knuckles turned white. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by genuine fear. As the plane began its descent, a new commotion erupted in the economy cabin. A child was crying loudly, and their mother's frantic voice carried through the plane. "My son needs his inhaler. It's in my bag in the overhead compartment, but I can't get to it with the turbulence." Derek unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, ignoring the flight attendant's protests. "I'll get it," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Jim watched him, frozen in place. His fear held him back, but so did his pride. Helping would mean acknowledging that Derek was, once again, stepping up while he did nothing. The conflict played out on his face, but in the end, he remained seated. Derek moved quickly through the swaying cabin, steadying himself against the seats as the plane shuddered. He reached the overhead compartment, retrieved the bag, and handed it to the mother. She fumbled to find the inhaler, tears streaming down her face, and Derek knelt beside her, helping to calm the child as he administered the medication. When Derek returned to first class, his shirt slightly damp with sweat, a few passengers clapped quietly, their appreciation breaking the heavy silence. He nodded at them but didn't linger on the moment, instead buckling himself back into his seat. Jim avoided Derek's gaze, his jaw tightening further. The applause only deepened his shame, and his anger turned inward. He hated the feeling of helplessness that had overtaken him, but he hated even more the growing realization that Derek's actions were a reflection of the person Jim wanted to be but wasn't. The plane jolted again, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Prepare for landing. We're coming in heavier than usual, so there may be a rough touchdown." The lights in the cabin dimmed, and the tension was thick enough to cut. Derek sat with his hands resting calmly on his knees, his breathing measured. Jim, still gripping his armrests, glanced at Derek and saw something that both infuriated and humbled him. A complete lack of fear. "Why aren't you scared?" Jim asked, his voice low but edged with desperation. Derek turned his head slightly, meeting Jim's gaze. "I faced worse than this," he said simply. "Panic doesn't solve anything." Jim's lips tightened, and he looked away, ashamed of his own terror. But something in Derek's words stuck with him, burrowing into the cracks of his stubbornness. The plane landed hard, bouncing once before the tires screeched against the runway. Gasps and screams filled the cabin, but after a moment, the plane slowed, finally coming to a stop. Relief swept through the passengers like a wave, and some even cheered. Derek exhaled slowly, his composure intact, while Jim slumped back in his seat, his face pale. As the plane taxied to the gate, Jim glanced at Derek again, this time without the venom that had marked every interaction before. He didn't say anything, but his silence carried a weight of unspoken acknowledgement. Derek, sensing the shift, offered a small nod but said nothing. The storm between them hadn't fully passed, but for the first time, the winds had begun to change. The emergency landing brought the passengers into a small, nondescript airport surrounded by rolling hills and rain-soaked tarmac. The plane had taxied safely to a halt, and paramedics were waiting at the gate to tend to the man Derek had helped earlier. The passengers disembarked in a daze, their nerves frayed but their relief palpable. For the first time in hours, Derek and Jim found themselves on the same level ground, though the tension between them lingered. As the passengers funneled into the terminal, Derek moved with practiced ease, his briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other. He was already coordinating a ride to his next meeting, navigating the disruption without complaint. Jim, a few steps behind, carried himself with less certainty. His mind raced, not with anger this time, but with the uncomfortable weight of self-reflection. Inside the terminal, passengers gathered near the service desk to rebook their flights. Some settled into the sparse seating areas, while others paced impatiently. Derek found a quiet corner and set up his laptop on a small table, intent on salvaging what he could of his disrupted schedule. Jim, standing nearby, noticed Derek's calm focus and felt a pang of envy mixed with guilt. The quiet hum of the terminal was broken when a group of passengers approached Derek. A middle-aged woman spoke first, her voice tentative but warm. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did back there, for the man who needed help, and for the child. You kept your cool when the rest of us were falling apart. Derek looked up, offering a polite smile. I did what anyone would do in that situation. Not anyone, the woman replied, glancing around as if to emphasize her point. It takes a certain kind of person to step up like that. Others in the group nodded, and one man added, You've got more class than most of us, that's for sure. Derek acknowledged their thanks with humility, exchanging a few kind words before they returned to their seats. Jim watched the exchange from a distance, his fists clenching at his sides. He wasn't angry at Derek anymore. Not in the same way, but at himself for how he had acted, for how wrong he had been. After a moment, Jim took a deep breath and approached Derek's table. Derek glanced up as Jim stood before him, an awkward silence stretching between them. Do you need something? Derek asked, his tone polite but guarded. Jim shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck. I owe you an apology, he said finally, the words coming out rough and halting. For the way I acted on the plane, for the things I said. Derek closed his laptop slowly, giving Jim his full attention. Go on. Jim's face reddened, but he pressed on. I made assumptions about you, about who you are, what you've done to get here. Assumptions that weren't fair or right. And I let my own biases cloud my judgment. Derek leaned back in his chair, studying Jim carefully. That's quite an admission, he said after a pause. What brought it on? Jim hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe seeing how you handled yourself when things got rough. Maybe realizing how small I looked, picking a fight with someone who wasn't even fighting back. Or maybe just realizing I've been wrong for a long time. And today was the first time I couldn't ignore it. The honesty in Jim's voice was unexpected, and for the first time, Derek saw something other than hostility in his eyes. He saw vulnerability, a flicker of regret that seemed genuine. I appreciate the apology, Derek said carefully, but words are only as good as the actions that follow. If you really want to make things right, don't just change how you treat me. Change how you treat everyone. Jim nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. You're right. I have a lot to work on. Derek offered a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. We all do. They stood there in silence for a moment before Jim extended his hand. It was a gesture laden with meaning, a tentative bridge over the divide that had separated them since the moment they'd boarded the plane. Derek hesitated briefly before shaking Jim's hand. The handshake was firm, respectful, and in that moment, a small but significant shift occurred between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As Jim walked away, Derek returned to his laptop, though his focus was now on something else entirely. The encounter had left him unsettled, not because of Jim's apology, but because of what it represented. The possibility of change, even in those who seemed least likely to embrace it. Across the terminal, Jim sat down heavily in a chair, his mind still replaying the day's events. He wasn't proud of how he'd acted, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that he could be better. That maybe, with time and effort, he could undo some of the harm he'd caused. The terminal settled into a tense quiet as the hours dragged on. The airline staff at the service desk struggled to rebook flights, their voices a mix of polite apologies and logistical jargon. Most passengers had resigned themselves to waiting, though occasional groans of frustration punctuated the low murmur of conversation. Derek had moved to a quieter corner of the terminal, his laptop open once more as he worked on a presentation. His focus was unwavering, but his earlier exchange with Jim lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't often that people like Jim apologized, much less admitted to their prejudices. Derek couldn't decide if Jim's words were genuine or just a way to save face. Across the terminal, Jim sat slumped in a plastic chair, staring at his hands. The tension in his body was gone, replaced by a strange heaviness. He replayed the confrontation with Derek over and over, his own words echoing in his head. Each time, they sounded worse. He didn't like the man he'd been on that plane. He didn't like the man he realized he'd been for years. The terminal's PA system crackled, announcing that passengers could retrieve their luggage from the baggage claim area due to the extended delay. The airline had arranged hotel accommodations for the night, and buses would soon arrive to transport everyone to a nearby hotel. Derek packed up his laptop and stood, adjusting his suit jacket. He moved toward the baggage claim, his steps unhurried but purposeful. Jim watched him go, his heart heavy with indecision. After a moment, he stood as well and followed, keeping a few paces behind. At the baggage carousel, Derek retrieved his sleek leather suitcase with ease and stepped aside to allow others room. Jim approached slowly, his bag clutched tightly in his hand. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Derek noticed him lingering and raised an eyebrow. "Was there something else you wanted to say?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Jim exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Yeah, there is," he said, his voice quieter than before. I don't know how to say this without sounding like an idiot, but I've been thinking about what you said." Derek crossed his arms, waiting. Jim shifted uncomfortably but pressed on. "You're right," Jim admitted. "I've been holding on to a lot of assumptions, biases, whatever you want to call them, and I've used them to justify the way I've treated people. People like you. I'm not proud of it. Hell, I'm ashamed of it. But I don't know where to start fixing it." Derek regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The fact that you're even asking that question is a start," he said finally. "But it's not up to me to guide you. Change isn't about finding the right teacher. It's about doing the work yourself." Jim nodded, his eyes downcast. "I figured you'd say something like that. I don't know if I can." "You can," Derek said firmly. "The question is whether you will." Jim looked up, surprised by the conviction in Derek's voice. "How do you stay so calm?" he asked. "When people treat you the way I did?" Derek let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You think I'm calm? I'm not. I've just learned that reacting emotionally gives people like you exactly what you want, a reason to justify your prejudice. Staying calm is a survival skill." The words hit Jim harder than he expected. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what Derek had said. As the buses arrived, passengers began boarding, lugging their suitcases through the rainy parking lot. Derek walked ahead, his stride steady and confident, while Jim followed at a distance, his thoughts churning. Inside the bus, Derek found a seat near the front, pulling out his phone to check emails. Jim hesitated before sitting across the aisle, keeping his head down. The ride to the hotel was quiet. The passengers, too tired or shaken to talk. At the hotel, Derek checked in quickly and headed to his room, eager to get some rest before the next leg of his journey. Jim lingered in the lobby, staring at the marble floor, unsure of what to do next. After a few minutes, he found himself wandering toward the small hotel bar. It was nearly empty, save for a bartender and one or two other passengers. Jim ordered a whiskey, his hands trembling slightly as he brought the glass to his lips. He didn't notice Derek enter the bar until the man was already seated a few stools away, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Derek glanced at Jim, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing. Jim sighed, setting his glass down. "Mind if I join you?" Derek shrugged. "Free country." Jim moved to the stool beside him, the silence between them stretching for a moment before he spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice low. "But I want you to know I'm going to try. To do better. To be better." Derek studied him, his gaze piercing but not unkind. "Good," he said simply. "That's a start." They sat in silence after that, two men on very different paths who had, for a brief moment, found themselves at the same crossroads. For Jim, it was a moment of reckoning. For Derek, it was a reminder of the resilience he had built over a lifetime. And for both, it was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. The early hours of the morning settled over the quiet hotel, rain still drizzling outside the large glass windows of the lobby. Most passengers had retired to their rooms, exhausted from the day's turbulence, both in the air and within the tense confines of the first-class cabin. The bar, where Derek and Jim now sat, remained hushed, with only the soft clinking of glasses breaking the silence. Jim swirled the amber liquid in his glass, staring into it as though it might hold answers. Derek, meanwhile, sipped his sparkling water, his posture relaxed but his mind alert. The conversation earlier had drained him more than he'd let on, but he wasn't ready to walk away just yet. There was something wrong, something real about Jim's presence now. A vulnerability that Derek recognized but hadn't expected to see. "I've been a cop for 18 years, Jim said suddenly, his voice rough, as if the words were dragged out of him. "It's a hard job. You see the worst in people. Drugs, violence, desperation. It messes with your head." Derek turned slightly, watching Jim out of the corner of his eye but saying nothing. "You start thinking everyone's out to get you," Jim continued. "And then you start grouping people together in your head. It's easier that way, less messy. But that's the problem, isn't it? It makes people like me blind to the good too." Derek set his glass down, his brow furrowing slightly. "Blindness is a choice," he said. "You don't just start grouping people together. You make a decision to let fear, or anger, or laziness dictate how you see the world." Jim flinched, but he didn't argue. "You're right," he said quietly. "I made that choice a long time ago. And today, on that plane, I saw where it's gotten me. You didn't deserve what I threw at you. Hell, no one does." Derek leaned forward, his voice measured but firm. "Do you know how many people like you have told me they've seen the light after treating me like dirt? How many times I've been expected to applaud someone for finally recognizing that I'm a human being? It's exhausting." Jim's head dropped, shame radiating from him. "I get that. And I don't expect you to applaud me. I don't even expect you to believe me. I don't want to be this person anymore." The honesty in Jim's words gave Derek pause. He leaned back, studying the man beside him. "If you mean that, then you have a lot of work to do. And it's not about proving yourself to me or anyone else. It's about showing up differently in the world, every day, in every interaction." Jim nodded, his grip tightening on his glass. "I don't know where to start." "Start by listening," Derek said simply, "to people who've lived lives you can't imagine, to stories that make you uncomfortable, to truths that challenge everything you think you know." Jim sat in silence, the weight of Derek's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. For the first time, he felt the enormity of the change he was trying to make. Not just a shift in perspective, but a complete rewiring of how he saw the world and his place in it. After a long pause, Jim said, "You're a better man than me. You know that?" Derek let out a soft laugh, though it lacked humor. "I'm just trying to survive in a world that wasn't built for me. That doesn't make me better. It makes me determined." Jim nodded, understanding in a way he hadn't before. "That determination. It's something I've never had to think about. I've never had to fight to be seen." "That's your privilege," Derek said bluntly. "And acknowledging it is just the first step." The bartender approached, clearing away empty glasses. Derek stood, straightening his jacket. "It's late," he said. "We both need rest. Tomorrow's another day." Jim hesitated, then extended his hand. This time, it wasn't a gesture of formality or guilt. It was genuine, a sign of respect, maybe even a quiet plea for a second chance. Derek stared at the outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it. "Good luck, Jim," he said. "The road ahead won't be easy." As Derek walked away, Jim sat alone at the bar, the rain outside blurring the lights of the terminal beyond. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man he thought he was. Instead, he felt like someone standing at the edge of something vast and unfamiliar, unsure of how to move forward but knowing he couldn't stay where he was. Derek, returning to his room, felt a strange mix of emotions. He didn't trust Jim's transformation, not yet, but he allowed himself a sliver of hope, not for Jim, but for the world. For the possibility that change, however small, might ripple outward in ways he couldn't yet see. For both men, the night was far from over. The confrontation on the plane had shaken them to their cores, but here, in the quiet of the terminal and the rain, they had begun to face the truths that would define the paths they would take next.